One of the biggest stories of the day is that Vladimir Putin won't be in Istanbul for talks with President Zelensky today. Russia is sending instead a low-level delegation headed by a former culture minister. President Trump won't be going now either. He had toyed with the idea of turning up at the last minute. Zelensky previously said he would attend the talks and meet Putin in person if the Russian president agreed, but there was some question about whether he would meet a delegation. Earlier on, Stig spoke to Seb Gorka, who's Donald Trump's senior director for counter-terrorism at the National Security Council. He put the blame firmly on Putin.
It's simply another demonstrable facet of Moscow not understanding that it is in their interest to come to the table with the only man who can bring peace to Europe. So sadly, one more instance of intransigence, but we hope they will see the light, and then the meat grinder of Ukraine and the conflict on the Eurasian landmass can be stopped.
One more incident of intransigence. That's Seb Gorka talking there about President Putin. You can hear the rest of that interview after 8 o'clock today. So what is happening in Turkey? Andrew Finkel is a journalist based in Istanbul and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
So there's been a lot of chopping and changing when it comes to the lineup for these talks today. Do we know that a set of talks is definitely going to take place on the issue of Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, we do know, but as you say, it's a bit like the dog that didn't bark. This was very much meant to be an encounter between the presidents of Ukraine and Russia, Putin and Zelensky. Putin hasn't turned up. Zelensky said he would not turn up if Putin didn't show. Zelensky is on his way to Ankara to have talks with the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan. But in Istanbul, he probably won't be going to Istanbul. There will be, as you said, a low-level meeting. This is, we hope, not a repeat of what happened in 2022 when the two sides met. It wasn't so much a negotiation as a declaration of stalemate. So expectations for today have been lowered considerably. There's some talk that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, will come to Istanbul tomorrow, but I imagine that would only happen if there's some sign of progress.
And the Russian delegation that's being sent, how should we read that? Because when we say a former culture minister, that sounds to me, as a political journalist, like you're not making very much effort there from the Russian side. Is that how we should look at it?
Not exactly. The cultural minister whom you refer to, Vladimir Medinsky, is an advisor now to Putin. He's coming with the deputy defense minister, Alexander Froman. These two people were present at those 2020 failed talks. So they're obviously familiar with the issues, have the ear of the president. But as you say, it's not the main act. It's something of a perfunctory meeting, or that's the signal that's being sent.
And I suppose that the question is, was this always going to be the way it went? Because to go from nothing to having the two leaders meet, that could have been quite a risky moment either way.
Well, as you will recall, the background to this was that President Trump was very much demanding a 30-day ceasefire from the Russian side. This was countered with an offer of direct talks in Istanbul. So it looked as though something really very real was about to happen, that there might be some actual negotiations going on to end this terrible conflict. But what may be the case is that Russia simply use that as a means of engineering a sort of stalemate. They may believe that they will have the advantage when the offensive resumes in Ukraine with the warmer weather. So what we're seeing is what was meant to be a serious encounter being downgraded.
And from Turkey's perspective, because obviously there had been high hopes that this would be a real moment, what's the view of President Putin, given that he's decided not to turn up? Is there any frustration with him?
Well, there's President Erdogan and President Putin have a long history of being frenemies, as it were. They've been negotiating on and off for many years. Both are masters of transactional politics. I think this is something that Turkey will take in its stride rather than perceive it as an insult. And again, I think from the Turkish perspective, it helps confirm that Turkey is an important player in resolving this conflict, that Turkish troops might be involved as a peacekeeping force if that ever happens. It has NATO's largest army. For Turkey, this is an element of prestige, and possibly a distraction from domestic politics.
And just finally, what is your expectation? I mean, you've covered this story. You understand the kind of the main players and the spinning plates, if you like. What do you think is likely to happen next?
Well, I'm sad to say my expectations are low, and I don't expect anything to happen next, or at least out of these talks. But I'm willing to be happily surprised.
Well, Andrew, you and me both, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's Andrew Finkel there, journalist based in Istanbul.
We've been told all along, haven't we, that Putin's main strategy here is that even a good deal for Putin might be worse than just stringing this along forever and ever. He wants Trump to be his kind of friend. Maybe he wants there to be a question of sanctions being removed. And actually, if you look at what Trump's just done in Syria, Trump has gone to Syria and he's not imposed any requirements on the interim president of Syria. He's basically said, we're going to give you a chance. And I wonder whether Putin thinks as long as he can keep Trump rolling along, things will be okay. But hearing from Seb Gorka, we'll hear again after 8 o'clock, at some point Trump, who's now being absolutely lionized by these Middle Eastern leaders, he might feel disrespected by Putin, mightn't he? And that might be the emotional change in all of this.
I think it's worth remembering, as you say, what President Trump said before this meeting. So about a week ago, he said there's now a clear offer from Zelensky about these talks on Thursday today. And if President Putin doesn't turn up, then that will be a clear sign to Europe and America of where things stand. And then he said, and we can then, quote, act accordingly. And the big question has been, what does act accordingly mean in this scenario? And it sounded like a threat, not as hard as it could have been, but certainly a hardening of language towards President Putin and Russia. I think today it's unclear to me how Russia can spin this as not a disrespectful move, given what President Trump has said. And I think it also really puts into sharp relief. I think we had somebody on the programme a week ago who was saying that Putin is in a real bind. His economy, the economic situation of his country is poor. He needs to keep the war going because when the war stops, the questions about spending start. Yeah. And as soon as you have that break, the domestic politics comes flooding back in again. And it is absolutely in his to his advantage to keep this going, or at least to draw out the theory of a pause long enough to rearm. And we'll be speaking to somebody, a Latvian foreign minister, on the programme later, because Russia has been massing troops and changing its battalions around the border with Latvia. And there are some people who are really concerned that they've used this pause as a moment to regroup and reshape their military, which is hugely concerning for those countries. Yeah,
how much does Putin require a wartime economy is the question that guest said to us last week, that factories were closing and then the war starts and all those factories open. There are villages and towns built around armament factories, and if they're still churning out armaments, then that's a big chunk of the war. I mean, the reason he's in this bind, because with sanctions and a lack of growth elsewhere in the economy, it's also a poor country, even if the armaments are increasing. So it's not clear how he gets himself out of this. And what he wanted to do was chum up with Trump. Trump gets offended if he's disrespected. And you can hear that in a very brittle tone. That's why he has people like Seb Gorka around him. That sort of brittle approach to diplomacy is very much at the heart of the administration.
But then he's also driven by economics. And if Russia can provide him with an opportunity to do financial deals, then that might make it easier for him to agree to it.
It's an interesting situation. We're going to try and keep an eye on this over the course of the morning. If anything changes, I mean, things can change quickly. I mean, Trump is not that far from the region, of course. He's in the Middle East at the minute, but we'll keep an eye on it.